Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world that is chaos of cybersecurity. We're happy to have you here. Welcome to Criticality Live, presented by Secure Nation, the show where you cut through the noise, challenge assumptions, and talk honestly about cybersecurity where we are today, because we are cyber unfiltered. All right, Kayla, it's great to have you back. We missed you last week.
Thank you. Happy to be back. It was great being in Ireland for Enterprise Ireland. 2 days in a row of sunshine. Can you believe it? Like
In Ireland?
in Ireland, I know it was great. It was absolutely beautiful. We were at the Guinness Conference Center and then at the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. So it was wonderful. It was a really good time. Great company to work with.
Sounds awesome. So, enough about us. Let's get into the real reason why everyone's here. So, today's guest is Jeff Mann. He's the kind of cyber OG people claim to be after they buy a hoodie and attend one conference and get their first badge. But Jeff isn't cosplaying his hacker creds. He was in the work before cybersecurity even had a marketing department, breaking systems, building trust, challenging assumptions, and dragging uncomfortable truths, or dare I say, even unpopular opinions, into the room. He's lived through cryptography, red teaming, PCI trenches, hacker culture, member of the long-running cybersecurity weekly ecosystem, where practitioners talk about all things related to cybersecurity. He's also put time into Hack for Kids, helping to bring the hacker curiosity and security education to the next generation. So today, it's not about buzzwords. We're going to go straight into the history, the heresy, and the hard-earned truth when someone who has more scars tissue than most vendors have slide decks. So, Jeff Mann, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. I've been looking forward to having this chat with you guys for quite a while now. The anticipation's killing. But first, Kayla, did you actually drink Guinness while you were in Ireland?
Okay, so I did. However, so my husband's English, and he said that I shamed him because I got like the small pour. And he was like, "How dare you?" And because Guinness is better in Dublin. But
yeah.
I flew over Sunday night, got there at 4 a.m. Monday morning. So I was just not in great shape. We didn't start until Tuesdays, but I didn't sleep and stuff on Monday.
But Guinness is a great pick-me-up for breakfast. I mean, they drink it for all meals in Ireland.
Well, Guinness ice creams. They'd never heard of that before. I think that's defiling it, but I do that over vanilla ice cream. Sorry, probably shouldn't. Sorry, kids under 21 don't drink. Disclaimer.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Enough about beer, I guess. So, what would you like to know? Where do you want to start? I'm guessing you have questions.
I do have some questions. So, I kind of wanted to start at the part that makes your career path kind of interesting, because you didn't start with some obvious cyber origins. You studied human resources in undergrad.
Yep.
So how does that turn into cryptography, red teaming, and kind of having that front row seat into what evolved into cybersecurity?
A fair question to ask, and it's a question that I have actually come up with the answer over the last couple of years. Coming out of COVID a couple of years ago, I put together a talk that was called "Hackers Are Neither Created Nor Destroyed." And it was really a defense of this whole notion of being a hacker. I identify now as being a hacker. Of course, we need to define that at some point. I define it as sort of a mindset, a curiosity, seeing the world differently. I don't pigeonhole into computer hacker, network hacker, this kind of the other hackers. To me, it's almost like a worldview. But on the podcast that I'm a part of, Paul Security Weekly, when we interview people, we'll always start the discussion with how'd you get your start in cybersecurity? And up until a couple of years ago, if somebody had asked me that, I would have said, well, I cut my teeth at NSA. But I had a lot of time to think during the COVID lockdown back in the early 20s. And I thought, that's not really a fair answer to the question. And you're framing essentially the same question in a little bit of a different way. So I set out to think about, how did I actually get to NSA? And that's an interesting story, and I have a full blown talk that talks about it. But in a nutshell, I can summarize with a few bullet points. Um, my dad was a physicist, and he came to the Washington D.C. area, which is where I grew up in the Maryland suburbs. He came here in the 1950s and got a job at an organization called the Naval Research Laboratory, and they were doing testing on what became the hydrogen bomb. They called it the hydrogen device. So he was a witness to the detonation of the first couple hydrogen devices. I didn't think about it at the time. I was a student, but when I was in college, I really didn't want to take a physics class. It's because I have daddy issues, but it just seemed like work. I always was looking for something, what major can I have where I don't have to take too much math, and above all else, I don't want to have to take a physics class. Didn't realize it at the time that it was just me being a defiant kid wanting to be different from my old man type of thing. But I ended up being a business major, and they came up with a concentration called human resource management. I thought that was kind of cool. How do you manage people and leverage people? That's certainly applicable to most business environments. So that's how I got my degree. How I got to NSA is a different aspect of answering that question. I was hired at NSA in the late years of the Cold War during the Reagan administration, where the strategy of the U.S. government was basically to bankrupt the Soviet Union and outspend them. So I was hired at NSA when they were hiring literally 100 people a week. They were going out and going to college job fairs, career fairs, visiting major universities. And they were looking for, we didn't call it STEM back then, it was called critical skills. They were looking for computer scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. I obviously was none of those. My mom had worked for a different naval organization near where I grew up. She was in personnel, HR, and she had a friend whose daughter had gotten a job at NSA as a mathematician, I believe. And so my mom was, Jeff, you ought to look into applying to this place. I'd never heard of it. I grew up in Maryland, never heard of NSA. It used to be a super secret organization. So I filled out the standard, I think it's called the SF 171 government job application, mailed it, physical mail off to Fort Meade, NSA headquarters, got a response, and was invited to Fort Meade for several days of testing. And this is the part of NSA I like. In taking this battery of different types of skills and aptitude tests, weird stuff. Some of the tests were kind of crazy. Some made sense because in those days, NSA was about code breaking and monitoring the communications of all of our adversaries throughout the world. So one of the tests was like an artificial language. It was a made-up language, and it was intercept message traffic that had been collected, let's say, by NSA. And your job was to try to figure out anything you could about this made-up language. Could you identify nouns and verbs and adjectives? Could you put together any kind of semblance of not necessarily reading the message, but could you figure out any kind of structure to the senders and the receivers of the messages, which were presumably troops and headquarters of adversaries, in a battlefield or war situation. One of the tests I took was a picture that give you a two-dimensional line drawing of a three-dimensional object, and they'd say, what does this thing look like from the back? Or what does this object look like from below? And I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. So it was like puzzles. And one thing that my dad did instill into me was a love of puzzles. When I was a kid, I'm the youngest of four boys. We would go to the beach for summer vacation, and my dad would buy a single copy of the Dell crossword puzzle magazine that had all sorts of different types of puzzles, including crypto quizzes, crypto puzzles, which is stuff that I liked to do even at a young age. And I think that helped to identify that, puzzle solving, problem solving was something that was built into me, which is something that NSA identified, and they offered me a job, and um, and so I went to work at NSA. Uh, my brothers and I and my dad, our favorite puzzle in the Dell magazine was the logic problem. Every episode, every issue had one or two, and if you were lucky, two, and rarely there would be three logic problems. And these are the types of things, if you're not familiar, where they give you like 7 or 8 statements about some sort of circumstance. Like it might be 5 or 6 different teachers, 5 or 6 different students, the subject, and the color of the classroom. And they give you like, Mr. Jones teaches Betty in the blue room, but doesn't teach her science. And you have to figure out, who's the teacher in what room, what subject do they teach, and the student's favorite teacher and all that kind of stuff. We used to have to do it on paper. They gave you a little chart to help doing it. We have to do it on paper. So that was something I loved doing, puzzles. I get to NSA. I had to actually interview for a job, and my first assignment ended up being at this place called Manual Cryptosystems Branch. I had gone, it was one of my first interviews, and I went and I met this guy that was a cryptanalyst. He was over from what we called at the time the operations side of the house. And I didn't realize I was like going on, it was basically like sales pitches more than job interviews. And he was telling me that this Manual Cryptosystem shop, he was telling me about manual paper crypto systems and how they'd sort of fallen by the wayside because technology and the proliferation of printers and machine cryptography, they assumed that paper was going to go away, but paper actually proliferated. So they wanted to have somebody, and this is what he was doing on a part-time basis, do security evaluations of the systems that NSA had built and produced and distributed to the field. So he told me, this is kind of a cool job. Where else are you interviewing? And I told him all these different places. He's like, oh, you don't want to work there. Ugh, you really don't want to work there. Oh, that one would be okay. But at the end of the day, he said, this is kind of a cool opportunity because they'll teach you how to be a cryptanalyst. They'll send you off for the training courses, which you need to advance your career as a cryptographer or a cryptanalyst. And so I went to, I didn't know any better. So I went to work for him because I was going to be doing puzzles. And I bring all that up in terms of, I'll round out this story. One day at lunch, while I was in this office, this guy, he was working on something at his desk. I said, hey, what are you working on? And he says, well, I'm writing logic problems. I'm like, tell me more. And he says, well, as a part-time job, I write logic problems for Dell Crossword Puzzle magazine. And that was one of those karma type of moments where I'm like, I don't know how I got here, but I know I'm in the right place. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
It does. And actually, part of it took me back to my childhood. I was raised largely by my grandmother, and I didn't realize it at the time. She had, a middle school education, but her hobby was doing cryptograms. Mm-hmm. She'd go to the dollar store and buy a stack of cryptogram books, and she taught me how to do this. And then
back in those days, they probably had newspapers with the comics pages, and you could find them there as well.
And the ironic thing is, I hated math, wanted nothing to do with math. And now, almost 30 years later, I teach cryptography at a university because my grandmother taught me how to do cryptograms when I was like 13.
Very cool. Well, and I am certified. I could show you my certificate, but it's right above me. But I'm certified as a cryptanalyst from NSA. I earned that back in 1993. But I did manual cryptanalysis. So while there was math involved, I didn't focus on the math. It was more the puzzle solving, the problem solving, and brute forcing and different cryptographic techniques to try to get to the solution. But math is unavoidable in cryptography these days. So I try to play along as best as I can.
Yeah. A couple things. Have you guys heard of the show called Ludwig? It's on BBC. It's an English show. You guys might like that. Check it out. Mm-hmm. It's a guy who makes and creates puzzles and uses them to solve crime. with the Met. It's interesting. It's different. It's different than what we're seeing on TV nowadays. But Jeff, it's funny you mentioned before about Paul's Security Weekly, because my kids know who you are because I have you on my YouTube when I flip through. In addition, obviously, to following Criticality Live, I follow Paul's Security Weekly, and they get to see you. I get to see you too, from going back to when I did the SOC Analyst Appreciation Day with Devo and being on with Paul and things like that. So for years, my kids have grown up seeing your face.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being a loyal listener and watcher for all these years.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm trying to get my kids interested in it. They're not at all yet, but yeah, maybe. I had an accounting degree and I moved in, so maybe they'll be late bloomers with it as well. But so it's really interesting that you mentioned you did human resources management and then moved into the NSA, because like that must have been such a big culture shock for you. Moving into that type of government role, like was there anything there that really took you by surprise? Obviously you didn't learn any of that in school, so how did you feel after the transition in?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I was kind of young and naive and just bopping along, kid in my 20s, fresh out of school. I really had the mindset, even though we were still in the final years of the Cold War, that warfare and countries fighting over countries and all this cloak and dagger spy stuff was really just isn't that all kind of archaic? Isn't that kind of a thing in the past? Like I said, I was young and naive. One of my first assignments in this manual cryptanalysis division was to I had a customer, let's say, approach me and say, hey, we're using this thing called a one-time pad, which is a paper system with essentially the key is written down random characters on paper, and you write your message down one letter or one character at a time, do some sort of algorithm to come up with the cipher that gets sent, and there's only one other copy of the key in the world on the other end, the receiving end. You reverse the process, you get back to the message. That was being used by a customer that was, let's say, working with people that were recruited in, let's say, Eastern Bloc countries. And so their reports that they were encrypting and decrypting were very lengthy. And so this customer said, it takes us hours and hours to do the decryption of these messages, but there's this thing sitting on our desk, an IBM PC standalone. Isn't there any way we could do this? And this whole process on the computer. And me being young and naive said, well, I don't see why not. That sounds like it makes sense. So that launched me into learning how to do project management. I had to learn how, what we called at the time, the information security directorate, so the defensive side of NSA. I had to learn how it all worked. And I guess I learned it maybe in college with my human resource management, but I actually went, if I needed to talk to somebody from a particular office doing a particular thing, I actually went and physically found them and walked up to them and said, hey, can we talk? I'm new and I'm trying to learn stuff. And so I wanted to learn what they were doing. But I had to find a computer programmer that could write the program. I had to go through what it turns out, this is my favorite hack of all time, as it turns out, but NSA at the time built little black boxes. The defensive side, our cryptography, our cryptosystems were machines, and they might be attached to a radio. It was mostly radio communications in those days, a little bit of telephone traffic, fax machines and stuff like that. But this is all prior to what we know of today with the internet and everything. And essentially, I had to go through a design process in the InfoSec organization. I had to follow a design specification guide that was written for hardware. And I was coming up with a software system, a software-based system. And the idea was people in the field would still use the one-time pad, the paper, but people in the controlled space in the office, they could use the computer. To do that, we had to figure out a way to put the key on a floppy disk so it could be put into the computer. And to do that, we had to figure out a way to emulate deleting a page at a time, because the paper pad, you use a page, you destroy it. And literally people in the field, their pads were very small and the pages were rice paper, and they would very often eat the things, because they were discovered with these pads, they pretty much ceased to exist in most cases. This is the Cold War. This is espionage. So I had to go through a hardware design review. I had to stand up in front of all the what I called suits, all the senior management, all the engineers and mathematicians that were in their 50s and 60s, and they had, suits and ties on, and they were sitting in this big boardroom behind a big table, and I'm coming in, we're going to do this stuff different, and we're going to do something new that's never been done before. I had to go through a security review, had to meet all the objections, and this was a computer-based system, so their objections were people can get to the computer, they can exploit the application, they can do something, they can steal the messages. And my point was, A, it's standalone, B, all the information that they're processing from these messages are sitting on that PC anyway. Why would you bother going through breaking the crypto system where you can just find whatever text file where the information has been stored anyway? So I got through all their objections, and I finally got them to say, okay, we'll let you do this. And this, I'll remember this to my dying day, that the guy that was the head guy, I won't say his name, but he said, well, we'll let you do this, but please don't do this again. They really didn't like it that we had pushed the envelope and put out a software-based system. To the best of my knowledge, that is the first software-based system that NSA ever produced, because that wasn't the business that NSA was in. Years later, same office, the fact that I had come up with a way of putting one-time pad key on a floppy disk came in very handy when I was approached by U.S. Special Forces. They were trying to modernize their communications base station, which the real world would know, especially if you're a ham operator, as a number station. They were trying to reduce the size of their base station, which was 2 semi-trucks, down to a few transit cases. And the key to doing that was using a laptop. And to use a laptop for communication with one-time pads, they needed to key on a floppy disk. And they came to us saying, is there any way we can do this? And I was able to say, just so happens we've already figured that out. And so, yes, we can do that. So this all happened in the first 3 years of my NSA career. And I remember thinking at the time, this is probably the highlight of my career. It's probably going to be downhill from here. But stay tuned. Ask me another question.
So you said that you identify as a hacker, and your definition kind of brought me back to kind of that MIT definition of a hacker, of someone who does something that's unique and ingenious in a way that was not designed to do that thing. But right now, people love to romanticize old school hacker culture.
Sure.
But you actually lived through it, particularly in those early areas.
Yep.
What do people fundamentally misunderstand about that period when they're romanticizing it now?
What do they misunderstand about it? Well, if you've watched the movies and, if you watch the podcast, Paul and I have a running tally when we ask our guests, what's your favorite hacker movie? His favorite hacker movie is Hackers. My favorite hacker movie is Sneakers. And a contemporary of that came out the same year of Hackers is a movie called The Net, Sandra Bullock. And of course, the quintessential hacker movie of all time is the movie War Games. More and more young people, it seems, are not familiar with these movies. So I would recommend to anybody listening, if you have not seen those movies, go watch those movies. They're all available on the streaming channels somewhere. I'm not going to promote any one or the other. But they're essential. War Games at the time, which came out in the 80s, like 82, 83, it was showing a high school kid that had a home computer that was attached to a phone line, because that's how we connected to the internet in those days.
Yeah.
Basically, he was into gaming and he was looking for new opportunities for games, and he was doing something called war dialing, which was dialing a phone number to see if a computer would answer on the other end. And it sort of was the classic, that's how it was done back in the 80s. Sneakers comes along in the early 90s, and it kind of shows essentially what's the methodology for most red teaming penetration testing companies to this day. 30 years old, kind of still stands. Hackers, as Paul likes to say, has a soundtrack. So it really showed the hacker culture of the time. People, the kids that were kind of on the fringe, not feeling like they fit in, every teenager, but, had a common love for gaming and computers. And then the net was interesting. It's a sleeper film, but I watched it again not too long ago, meaning in the last year or two. It was actually one of the fears that we don't ever talk about was it was essentially identity theft. The Sandra Bullock character was erased. She didn't exist. So none of her credit cards worked. She didn't have a bank account anymore. She literally didn't exist. What people get wrong from back then in terms of romanticizing these movies would portray internet access as very fast. It wasn't back then. It's kind of like watching your detective shows where they're searching the database for facial recognition. I love it when they're like scrolling the faces on the screen. I'm like, nobody would ever do that. That's so much bandwidth, and that would slow things down a whole lot. So I'd say the romanticizing is the speed that things happened, and the elegance and the creativity of the compromises and the attacks that were happening at the time. When I got into breaking into computers and networks in the early 90s, it was very much just taking advantages of the features and knowing a lot of the features of the operating systems. And these systems were designed to create open communications and promote data transfer. They weren't really designed to restrict access or limit access or only send certain data to certain other places. So I would say the romanticism has to do with the speed that things happened and the sophistication of things happening. I remember at the time we'd always talk about the Uber hackers, the quintessential Uber hackers. Now, I did that I did pen testing from the early 90s to about 2004, which is when I got into PCI, and I sort of hung up my pen testing hat, as it were. But I was always looking for those Uber hackers. And I got back into this industry when I went to work for a vendor about 13 years ago. And I was told, hey, we want you to go out and start telling stories and, give talks at conferences, be one of our evangelists. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be running into those Uber hackers. And the FOMO was, I was never an Uber hacker. I was effectively a script kiddie. I knew how to do some things, but I wasn't this impression of an Uber hacker. 13 years later, I'm still waiting to meet the Uber hackers. I found out, I don't have specific skills like other people do, but I've done some things that other people have not done. And I've had been very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time and have the right mindset, if you will, to do some things. So I think the biggest misperception is, I think and I always kind of chuckle at it, and it's back then, and even to some degree to this day as well, is the sophistication of the adversary and the sophistication of the attacks, where if you knew how easy it was, you wouldn't be throwing that term about. Sometimes, and there's exceptions, of course, but that's my take on that.
Yeah. I know for me, looking back, the things that I did that were, not necessarily the most up and up. I look back now and go, it wasn't hard. It was actually pretty easy, particularly compared to what you'd have to do to get the same access today.
Sure.
Do you ever have some imposter syndrome thinking, because you do have these aura around you of being one of the OGs in cybersecurity, and talking about how things weren't really that hard for you from the red teaming perspective?
Well, funny you should mention red team. We'll go off on that tangent in a minute. I do and I don't have imposter syndrome. I never had to write an O day. And the team that I worked with at NSA, which were immortalized in a book called Dark Territory. where they refer to us as the Pit. And the Pit happened to be the nickname that we gave our office. So how we got into the folklore and the history, still haven't figured that out yet. But at NSA, I was part of, and I call myself the architect of the first red team, although we didn't call ourselves a red team at the time. My particular talent, if they made a movie about us, like, similar to Sneakers, I was the guy that was, willing to push the button. If they said, okay, we've done all the research and we're pretty sure if you push this button, or if you hit, if we type in this command or type in this script and we hit execute, I'm pretty sure it's going to work. I'd be like, okay, well, let's see if it happens, and just do it. For me, my talents were not writing the scripts. My talent was, or what I brought to the table was, ironically, the organizational skills. I call myself the architect because I did have a business background. And when we were trying to do these things that we called pen tests and do it for NSA and do it legally, we had to talk to the lawyers. And I was the one that was willing to talk to the lawyers. My oldest brother's a lawyer. I kind of knew how to speak to lawyers. I had a liberal arts degree, so I had to take a business law course in college. So I'm like, yeah, I'll talk to the lawyers, no problem. So I did things that other people didn't do. And like any team, everybody brings different skills and talents to the table. Not everybody does the same thing. Very much like my earlier experiences with the Manual Cryptosystems office, where my customer was special forces. If you think of special forces teams or Navy SEAL teams, these are teams of 6 or 8, 10 or 12 people, but everybody has a specific skill. Everybody's cross-trained on everybody else's skills, but everybody brings something different to the table. So in that sense, I've never had the FOMO. And especially going around the first couple of years of being sort of back in the conference scene, I've met all the famous people. I've met all the people that I think most people would consider to be the uber hackers of the day. And I hope this doesn't come across as arrogant. And if it does, I apologize. But I've met all these people. A lot of them look to me with some degree of reverence, as, oh, you're the pioneer, you paved the way for us. But I have yet to meet somebody that's done all the things collectively that I've done in my career. And I don't break into things anymore. I try to keep up to speed with the people that do that type of thing still. I can still converse with them, but I couldn't sit down and do any of that. And one of the reasons I stopped doing pen testing was I couldn't really, when it got to be more sophisticated, I didn't have the mindset and the interest to do that. My mindset and interest was more, we keep getting hired by companies to break in and show them all their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses so they'll close things up. And we come in 6 months later, a year later, and we're still breaking in the exact same way we broke in before. There's got to be a different way to get through to these people to try to make them understand why it's important that they do this thing that we now call cybersecurity. So I set out to do what I think, in my opinion, is the harder job. Some people have co-opted this term, the human hacker. We might know somebody that has that moniker. But I really that was kind of like, I gotta go after the people in the organizations to try to make them understand why. In those days, it was more getting root rather than getting domain admin, but why that matters and why that's serious and why you really shouldn't be letting that happen. And there weren't a whole lot of people that do that. So I'm very comfortable at this point, almost 45 years into this thing called InfoSec or cybersecurity, with knowing what I can do and knowing what I can't do. And I'm very comfortable with letting other people have all the technical chops, but I'm also very comfortable in saying that isn't going to get you there. You can, you can be as technical as you want, but if you're not understanding all the other things, you're just a voice crying in the wilderness, and you're going to be forever pulling your hair out, trying to get your customer or your organization to fix things or do things different because they're not getting it when you say, look what I did.
Yeah. So when people call you an OG, what part of that makes you proud, and what part of it makes you roll your eyes then?
Um, I mean, I like the part about being called an OG because I really was in this from the very beginning. I gave a talk a year ago at a university up in Pennsylvania, and I had been giving a talk on, it was sort of the third installment of my life story, a professional life story. And it was what basically how somebody that was an NSA cryptographer pen tester ended up doing PCI. So the time span was roughly 96 to 2004. And a lot of what was in that talk was references to that time period. So I'm going to this college thinking, holy crap, these are young people that haven't lived through all this stuff. They're not going to get all my cultural references. And I was on my morning walk before the talk. And I thought, something that would be probably of particular interest to them is to realize that when I was doing the pen testing stuff back in the 90s, literally every device on the internet was connected by a physical wire. And then I thought, gee, is that right? So I Googled it. I said, was every machine physically connected by wire in the mid 90s? And of course, Google/AI, here's my dig at AI for our session today. It came back and said, no, not every machine was connected by wire. Most machines in that time period were connected by a phone line. And I'm like, well, stupid AI, what the hell do you think a phone line is? Anyway, so if you get around to asking me the AI question and what I think about AI, you might have a little hint of where I would go with that question.
You'd mentioned the movies that you guys are talking about, and the first time I ever saw any type of computer hacking, if you will, was Jurassic Park. Yes, I'm younger than you. I'm sorry, but that was the first time I had seen it. So I didn't actually see like war games or hackers or the net until much later.
Right.
So I know, shout out to the millennials that are listening. I hear you.
Well, and that's fine. I mean, I used to give talks, and I would try to get to know the audience, do an icebreaker by like, what's your favorite hacker movie? And it got to the point where nobody had seen any of the movies. So I'm like, okay, I got to come up with some new icebreaker to give a talk. But I was going to say something, but it left me. So let's move on.
Well, I was just thinking about like how, talking about being an OG, because to me, like that Jurassic Park was like the first time I'd ever seen it. And that was what, mid 94, 95, maybe at that time frame, which is probably around the same time those other movies were being made, but they were rated R. So I didn't get to see them. Probably.
Yeah, it makes me think that Jurassic Park might have been a little bit later, maybe in the late 90s. If only we had a way of looking that up. So your second part of your question was what I don't like about being called an OG is I sometimes get the sense from the younger people that they're like, okay, old man, okay, boomer, let us run circles around you because we understand the world a lot differently. And I will acknowledge wholeheartedly that younger people are in a lot of ways way smarter. That's amazing. 1993 is when it came out. Interesting, because that was more of it was a Trojan. It wasn't. I was going to say it was malware, but the hack in Jurassic Park was a Trojan or virus. So that makes sense. I've had many conversations with people that are like, they're kind of thumping their chest as guys do, or I don't know what the female equivalent is, but men and women, mostly guys. I think women have a little bit more humility in this sense, but I'm young, I'm smart, I'm talented, I know all this stuff, and you're just an old man. What do you know? And I can go toe to toe with them on technical conversation. I can't go keyboard to keyboard with them necessarily, but I can tell them why they're doing what they're doing. I can tell them why it works, why it doesn't work, how it works, what, the first time it was done, because you think it's new, but no, that technique goes back, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And I have yet to have one of those types of encounters where the people don't come away. They may not like me, but I think they walk away respecting, okay, the old man kind of knows what he's talking about.
So it sounds like you definitely have a line witch in the wardrobe moment of Aslan. Don't speak to me of the old magic witch. I was there when it was created.
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, I predate what we know as the internet, and the things that I did that I've been in museums for, like things that I did with the manual cryptosystem shop. Um, that's years before I ever did any of this internet stuff. But the other side of that is, and I think young people are a little bit in their ego, and in their sense of self-worth or pride. They're not always willing to listen to somebody from the old times because they think that they know everything and they've evolved to everything. And frankly, my message for the last 13 years or so of me going around giving conference talks is, we're not really doing this thing called security right. And there's this whole subculture and language and vocabulary that's grown out of it that was not the vocabulary that I was using when I was learning all this stuff. Where did it come from? Oh, and it's not to pick on people. It's come from sales and marketing departments. But I've spent a lot of time just trying to help people. You keep using that word, and I don't think you know what it means. And I'm not talking about fancy stuff. I'm talking about words like vulnerability and risk and threat. And I even went around one year, asked people, you claim to be an expert in security. What is security? Define it for me. And some of these Uber hacker types were the ones that stumbled the most because they understood the complexity of the question that I was asking. But in doing all that, I'm not trying to change people's minds and get people to think like I do. I just like to make people think, because so many of the quote unquote experts, and what do we call them nowadays? Influencers. They're basically an echo chamber. They're regurgitating what they're hearing in the mainstream, kind of like what AI does, frankly. And they're 80% accurate, 85% accurate. And me, I get hung up on the 15%. If you say something and you use the wrong word, or you use a word that, one of my biggest pet peeves is when vulnerabilities or threats are mentioned as synonymous in whatever discussion. I'm like, no, those are separate things. They're obviously related, but they're distinctly different because they're variables in an equation that I learned back in the day. And I hope that I've evolved at some point over the last couple of years, rather than being snooty and egotistical and arrogant about, oh, you're using the wrong language, you moron, to trying to be more constructive and say, hey, that word, I think you may think it means this, but does it really? What about this word? And what is the big picture? And so on and so forth. So my goal at the end of the day is to try to make people think. I don't know if that's as disruptive as you guys like, but it can be pretty damn disruptive for the right person.
All right. So last week I did a talk at B-Sides NOLA, and one of the folks that were there that did the badges and part of the Lockpick Village is Foxpick. And one of the things they were doing was raising money for this charity called Hack for Kids,
right?
That I think you might know a little bit about.
I do. And I also
what
know
made you decide?
Mike,
what made you decide that giving kids access to the tools to do hacker curiosity and security education? Why did that matter to you? And why do it so young versus college age kids?
Well, I didn't start Hack for Kids. I came on. I was invited onto the board right before COVID shut the world down. But I met the guy Dave Schwartzberg, or Heel, as he's sometimes known. I met him, probably 10 or 11 years ago at a conference, and found out he did this thing called Hack for Kids, and he invited me to speak at one of their conferences. Again, this is all probably 10, 11, 12 years ago. I was fascinated, because I love young people in general as opposed to adults, because they're just more fun to hang out with. I love their Uh, I love the curiosity, and I have grandchildren now. I see this in my grandchildren. I love the wonder and the awe of young people discovering things for the first time. Um, I I believe that we start out with a whole lot of ability and capability and possibilities and time in life, and the system kind of wears us down to sort of focus on one thing. Um, but why young people? The younger, the better. Hack for Kids, focuses primarily on middle school to high school. If a younger kid that's a fourth or fifth grader shows a lot of aptitude and interest, they'll probably be brought in. But the idea is sort of a youth-oriented hacker conference in miniature, youth-oriented, but they get to do a lot of the same stuff that are done at hacker conferences and security conferences in terms of CTFs and soldering stations and building and breaking things. And I mean, sometimes we'll just pile up a bunch of old hardware and let them just tear it apart to just see what it's, just let the curiosity flow. Um, they've had robot wars at different conferences. And the whole idea is to just, expose the children to the possibilities. What I believe in, and it's really based on how NSA was able to hire me. I would not have been hired by NSA because I wasn't a critical skill if they hadn't had that battery of tests that they gave me, where my aptitude and abilities, came through in my test scores. That's the part I like about NSA. So that's what I'm trying to promote with my involvement with Hack for Kids is trying to expose young people to all the things, as many things as possible, and look for the ones that you can see the twinkle in their eye, or you see them just get excited because of this. And they never knew that they were into that, but they find out, wow, this is something that's really cool. It's very imprecise. It's very unscientific, but I think it's very meaningful. And I think it's very important that we have ways of discovering things. Now that flies in the face, I know, Kayla, you mentioned your kids. Joshua, I don't know if you have kids, but we as parents
Three
tend to
daughters.
want our kids to thrive in some field, and very often kids are pushed towards the things that we look for in terms of STEM, because we see that as the future. Um, I mean, I said earlier that I had daddy issues, but one of the things that my dad always used to say to my brothers and I was, and he meant this, I says, I don't care what you do in your life as long as you feel like you're making a difference, as long as you're happy. And he used to say, you can be a trash man, a garbage collector. And if you do that, fine. Just be the best darn garbage collector that there ever was. So he wanted us to achieve and excel, but he didn't care what we did. And for all my issues with him, that was one thing that he said that was kind of cool. Still didn't take physics, and I'm happy with that. But that's the type of thing that I try to put into Hack for Kids. That's the kind of thing that Hack for Kids tries to do. My specific interest in Hack for Kids is trying to diversify and get Hack for Kids as a mini conference, as a venue of discovery for young people, to a more diverse set of young people, because we tend to attract kids from the suburbs, and even though we're attached to major cities, we don't always attract or draw all the kids from underserved communities. And I have a particular interest in serving the underserved. I'm not saying I'm doing it well. It's taking time, but there's a lot of people out there with a lot of skill and a lot of aptitude and a lot of possibility of all ages. And, we argue in our industry about, either all the job openings that are out there, and how hard they are to fill them, or all the people that are currently out of work because they've been laid off because AI is going to do their job for them. I get approached a lot by young people. at the various conferences I go to, at some of the Hack for Kids conferences, I go back to my high school every once in a while. They do job career fairs and they invite alumni in. I've actually started working at my alma mater. It was a college when I was there. It's a university now, trying to work with young people. I often get asked, what do I have to do to get into this? How should I start? Especially at hacker conferences. I want to be a pen tester. How do I become a pen tester? Every time a kid asks me that, I'm like, if you have to ask, that's what I want to say to them at some point, but I'm trying to be polite. What I do say is there's a lot to this business, this industry, this world of cybersecurity. There's a lot of different aspects to it. Expose yourself to as much as you can, different things as you can, because you might think this is what you want to do, because we tend to lift it up and elevate certain job roles over others. And that may be what you're good at and what you want to do, but expose yourself to everything. Find out what you're good at, or whether you think you have an aptitude or a propensity of, I might be able to do this. Find out what you like doing. If you're really, really lucky, what you like doing and what you have the potential to do, or you think you have some aptitude for, will be the same thing. And then you found your sweet spot. Do that. Maybe that's a little bit pie in the sky, because, we still have to pay bills and pay the mortgage and all the rent and stuff like that. But at least going into it, I think it behooves all of us to expose ourselves as much as possible if we're looking for any kind of career field change. I mean, in a few days, I will be 64 years old. I've been doing this stuff for almost 45 years. I didn't grow up thinking, I'm going to have a career in information security that's going to then become cybersecurity. It didn't really exist. I kind of fell into it because I liked doing puzzles. I found a place at a job that was essentially working puzzles, and I made a living out of it. And I was exposed at the right time in history where I got to do some things. But, I've talked to contemporaries of mine and people I used to work with at NSA, especially in the pit. I'm like, I'm not the only one that was the pit. You guys were involved too. But they said, yeah, but you're the one that did this. You're the one that did this. And so that's my personality, or that's my hacker mentality, which is, I'm not going to accept that this is the way we do things. I'm going to look for a different ornery. Maybe it's being obstinate. Maybe I'm a little bit on the autism spectrum. I don't know. All I know is, if you tell me to do something, I'm going to find a different, or what I think is a better way to do it. And I've kind of made a career out of that. I also find what's wrong with everything, and that tends to be in the vein of logic. I look at the logic flaws, and once I see them, I can't help but see them. And that makes me a very good consultant, advisor, going into organizations and trying to find what's wrong. A lot of people come in with, here's my list of questions and I'm looking for an answer, and they don't really listen. They're just writing down the answer. I go in and say, just tell me what you do. Show me your day to day. What's the typical day of you doing business? If there's something wrong in what you're doing, I will see it. I can't tell you how I see it. I can't tell you when I'll see it. But my job is to find the weaknesses and what's wrong. And I say that, and I was listening to your guys' interview of Philip Wiley from I don't know when you interviewed him. I listened to it a couple of days ago. And you asked him the question, people, process, technology. Ask me the same question, please.
So I'll ask you the same question.
Thank you.
Tell me about people, process, and technology, and where those align.
I think our whole industry is focused on the technology, and we seem to, what's wrong with our industry? We think the technology is going to solve the problem. I personally think technology is the problem. It's a very common response to say the people are the problem, which is the response that Philip gave. But after 45 years in the business and effectively 30 years of working with companies as a consultant. So I've been in hundreds of different types of companies, organizations, environments, cultures. I think the what's missing the most, and what's ignored the most, and what's given the least amount of attention, but is the most important thing, is the process. If you talk to a pen tester and they have findings, and I have to read pen test reports because of my PCI job. I'm looking for root cause, and the root cause is there's a patch missing. No, the root cause is why wasn't the patch that was available put onto that machine? That's a process failure. Why wasn't this system hardened? Process failure. Why didn't these people have the right level of access? Process failure. To me, it's all about process failure. I was at RSA-C conference a couple months ago and interviewed the president and one of the presidents of RSA, not the C company, but the rebranded technical company RSA, and their CEO. And we got around to talking people, process, technology. I asked their president that, and he said, "Oh, it's people." And I said, "Well, I think it's process." And he said, "Well, it's still people." I said, "How about it's the people not following the process?" He goes, "Oh, okay, I can live with that." So anyway, I didn't want to throw Philip under the bus, but I was like, I wanted to be part of the conversation when you were talking to him. I was like, damn it, it's process. It's not just people.
I agree with you because I'm a former auditor. So I see things exactly the same way that you do. And that from that lens of your process, it needs people, it needs technology, but if you don't follow the process, you're SOL, as they say.
Yep.
But that hour has gone by so incredibly fast, Jeff. Oh my gosh, this was so interesting. Like, you have such a wonderful background and story, and I appreciate listening to it. I could listen to it all day, right? So what we do is we always end Criticality Live with like a set of 4 questions. And so I would like to ask you, if you could fix one thing about the cybersecurity industry overnight, what would it be?
See, I heard these questions asked, so in theory, I'm prepared for them. I don't think there's a single thing wrong, but if I was going to fix one thing, it would be to fix the collective understanding that technology will ever solve all of this. My personal belief is that technology is not the solution. Technology is the problem.
Yeah.
All right. So my follow-up for that is, what's a practice, going back very clearly to your process side, it can be technical or culture, that you wish organizations would just stop doing because it's ineffective?
Stop doing, that might be a little bit severe. But I can tell you from my early days of being out in the private sector and going into organizations and trying to sell consulting and advisory, hey, we can help you build a security program. We can help you architect your network. We're the experts type of thing. People always kind of, or very often would say, yeah, but we only have so much money to spend, and our bosses are really going to want us to see something. So we need to really buy that technology solution, as I refer to it, that blinky box. And their question is more, how many blinky boxes, where do we put them, and what color is the light supposed to be? If I could change one thing or halt one thing, it would be the mentality that security needs to be addressed primarily by a technology solution or an application, or just the term solution. That's one of my pet peeve buzzwords. I don't think there are solutions out there. All I think there are out there are tools, and tools are only are most effective. I shouldn't say only, are most effective when wielded by people that know what they're doing. My example that I've given for many years is, I could hand you some paintbrushes, I could hand you a palette of paints, and give you a blank canvas. You've got everything you need to create a masterpiece. Now go do it. Obviously, not everybody's going to be able to do that. So what's missing is the cultivating and finding the people that have the talent and the skill and the aptitude, which is way beyond just the technology, quote unquote, solution being dropped in. And the second aspect of that is thinking you're done when you've dropped in the technology solution. Okay, I don't have to think about security now because I'm protected by all these blinky boxes and all the lights are green. I'm good.
Yep.
So mentality, I guess, is the short answer.
The longer you're in technology, the less you seem to like it. At least that's my my interpretation. I'm not as simple as you are, Jeff. All right. So if our listeners want to follow you, what's the best way to do that?
I'm old and I got tired of running down all the different social media platforms, the mastodons and the what's the other one that's popular? Sort of de facto is LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, or if you go to securityweekly.com, you can find my bio there, which I think has my LinkedIn link. If you spell my name correctly, that's MAN, one N, and you just go to Google and put my name in security. You'll find many of the recordings of the talks I've given. I'm interviewed on a bunch of different podcasts. I should give a shout out to one of my favorite podcasts, Darknet Diaries. I'm episode 83. I share that with Marcus Carey. But LinkedIn is the de facto best way to find me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. Well, that's a wrap on this episode of Criticality Live, everyone. Huge thanks to our guest, Jeff Mann, and an even bigger thanks to you for hanging out with us and being part of our growing community of leaders who are done with the buzzwords and are ready for real combos. If you got value out of today's episode, hit the follow button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop us a review here on LinkedIn, Spotify, or on our on-demand YouTube channel. And of course, a big shout out to our sponsor, Secure Nation, for powering our conversation today. They're helping organizations defend smarter, respond faster, and make cybersecurity something that actually works. So go check them out. This has been Criticality Live, where we cut through the noise and get to what really matters. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.